and academics. Hosted by the Raleigh International Spy Conference in North Carolina, it's about an hour and 10 minutes.
Good morning, Will. This is the panel section, which is more relaxed. We didn't hurry you up too badly on the time, where it has always been informative every year we've done this, just to get, first of all, a kind of an overview from the speakers that you've already heard, and then let them know that you know what they think about the conference. I usually like to start it with a couple of questions of my own to get it going. But first, let me say, it's been a great ride, and I want to make sure I thank all the speakers in front of, because later on with Brian's speech, we might not have that chance. I think it's just been a wonderful conference so far, one of the very best. And last night's party was a great party, and so everything seems to be working and moving really well. I thank all our speakers. Let's give them a round of applause. And let me start the panel by going chronologically with the order of speakers, and start with Art Padilla, whom you remember Wednesday night did a very wonderful overview and gave us an introduction and a base, and what Cuba is and who Castro is, especially his leadership style. But Art, to me, the personal grip of Castro seems to be the deciding factor in his regime, and his ability to use propaganda and to convince people. Either, of course, he's using force behind that convincing, but the long speeches are such a great characteristic of his regime. How can you tie that in more specifically to the leadership style, as if he were a CEO or another nation's president?
Yeah, that in addition to the long speeches, I think his capacity to hold his bladder is also equally amazing. I don't know how you do that, especially at that age. But he does a lot of the things that we observed from other leaders. And at some level, leadership is leadership. And I recall Greenspan talking right after the Soviet collapse about politics and what impact that would have. Later on, he amended that, saying, politics can be trumped by culture. But Castro has some of the same characteristics as do a lot of leaders. For example, compare Clinton with Castro in terms of childhood. Clinton had an amazingly difficult childhood. His natural father died. Last name Blythe, as probably all of you know. And he had a very rough childhood. Hitler, Mussolini, others had these sort of contrasting relationships with the father in particular. And the mother was very strong and very interested in pursuing, encouraging education of the children, which was unusual in many of those cases 50, 75 years ago. And Clinton, in his book, in that amazingly long book, 900 pages, but the only part that I really read or enjoyed was the part where he talked about developing parallel lives, where he learned to deal with really bad conflicts and put them on the side and then turn to other things. And Castro had the same sort of focus. Very bright, formidable memory by accounts from people who knew him. Very determined to grab center stage, and also very gifted at getting publicity from early on. It was as if he were dancing on top of a volcano without getting burned. So, and then his most favorite possessions were the 10, 12-volume Mussolini set, and by the time he'd emerged from the mountains, he had perfected a lot of his mannerisms and speeches. If you look at the way Castro speaks, which is very sort of bizarre, it evokes images of Mussolini. And even when he took on the writers and the artists, all within the revolution, nothing outside of it, that's straight out of a Mussolini quote from the 1930s. So Bill Bill Clinton also had the same patterns as Stephen Jobs at Apple. I don't know if you remember the Super Bowl commercial, 1984, where Apple goes after IBM, calls it Big Brother, creating an enemy. That's one of the other patterns that we see from totalitarian regimes. They create an enemy and they just keep that going. The only way you're going to be saved is by supporting me and keeping me in power.
It's like Umberto said, everything that Castro did in the revolution was mostly a failure. There was no real battle won, no real success. And the second thing that came to my mind was, remember, I forgot now, when Clinton first came on the national scene, he gave the famous speech at the Democratic National Convention. Remember that? And he talked for, remember that, 2 hours or whatever it was. It set some sort of record. So that's a wonderful analogy.
Yeah, his biggest applause was when he said, and in conclusion, and the crowd just went berserk. I remember that part.
Thank God, yeah. I'm going to go to each speaker, and then we can ask questions of everybody. Don Boning, wonderful chronology that really laid the groundwork about the United States activities against Cuba. But I hope you don't mind me asking this, but Janet Winiger was going to come to the conference, and you know Janet, and I thought that would be a great thing to ask you, and you'll tell them about her, but about the composition of the Bay of Pigs forces and the fact that there were allegedly no Americans involved. Can you tell them quickly about Janet Winiger and the Bay of Pigs?
I don't know. Umberto, I think, knows more details about that. The CIA recruited clandestinely the Alabama Air National Guard to help fly some missions over the landing site, and Jan Weininger, Jan Ray, her father's name was Ray, was shot down on one of the overflights, and they were paid clandestinely by an outfit from Miami whose name I forget, a corporation, I can't remember the name of it, a CIA front. That's something I didn't mention in my remarks, though, during that period of time there. Ted Shackley told me they had as many as, at one time or another, some 300 front companies in Miami, ranging from real estate companies to marinas to a motel in the Keys. It was amazing. But Jan's father was shot down in, 61, and she is a persistent lady, and she probably knows as much about the Bay of Pigs as anybody I know. She finally found out that her father's body was still in Cuba, and she finally got it released and brought back to Miami in, I think, the early 1970s. Umberto, do you remember when it was brought back? About?
It was in the mid-90s.
Yeah, late 80s, early 90s.
But that,
maybe.
well, maybe they discovered it was in Cuba in the 70s and brought it back. And that's probably what it was.
But Castro kept the body in a freezer.
Right,
he needed
exactly.
to pull it out to prove to the American public and the world that there were actually Americans in the Bay of Pigs Expeditionary Force,
right,
as a way to show it wasn't totally a Cuban operation. So it's a fascinating story, and how he kept that body in a freezer.
That's right, yeah. But Jan went around and still does, pounds on she talked to everybody ever involved in the Bay of Pigs at a policy level, I think, including Richard Bissell. And she went to Jay Kesterland, she went to Jack Hawkins. Esterlin thought Hawkins had died after the Bay of Pigs or committed suicide, and she was the one that told him that Hawkins was still alive. So it was an amazing story.
Well, thanks for that, and then later on we can talk more about Bay of Pigs when we get to open.
Let me just make one other unrelated observation. We were talking to Brian Littell the other day, and we both came to the conclusion, I guess independently, that Castro's zenith of his prestige, international prestige and power, was probably the Non-Aligned Conference of September 1979, at which Yasser Arafat, Saddam Hussein, Tito, I think, was there, wasn't he? Yeah, Tito was there, and Sandinistas were in power in Nicaragua, and Maurice Bishop was in power in Grenada, and Michael Manley was in power in Jamaica. And now it looks like his last hurrah might come when they host the next Non-Aligned Conference this September. I don't think it'll be anything like the first one.
Yeah, he's talking about what Tim touched on, which is something that's interesting to me, when our friend Chris Andrew, in our first year, the keynote speaker, in his latest book on the second edition of the Metrokin Archive, goes into detail about the non-aligned movement as a front used by the Soviets to push their cause against the Western cause. And Castro became the proxy leader of that. And they used that effectively, and still still do it. Looks, I mean, of course, the Soviet Union's not there, but that third world movement, as we know it, non-aligned movement, is not as familiar. Thanks, I'm glad you added that. Tim Naftali, I loved the perception we got of that Khrushchev's interest in putting missiles in Cuba was not in cahoots, as it appears, with Castro. When Castro says, well, I don't need missiles, and then it was explained to him that the Soviet Union needed missiles for shoring up their image abroad while they were looking at power confrontations with the West in Berlin, but most interesting in Laos. Tim, thanks for that point of view. But Tim, this whole business seemed to be, in the beginning, about when was who a communist, right? I mean, when was raleigh 1, and was Castro really one ahead of time, and did he just suddenly have a cri de conscience in 1961? But I would like to know, personally, about the time in Mexico. I mean, this is just the outsider observation that after they were exiled out and went to Mexico, where Che became connected to the Castro brothers, and Che was obviously a great devotee of the cause and part of the Soviet attack. What do you think? Have you done anything about the details of how much time they spent in Mexico, and could Fidel have become devoted to communism in that time in Mexico? Has it been looked into, I guess is my question.
Well, it's a very good question, Bernie, and it was certainly something that I had in the back of my mind as Alexander Ferzenko and I reviewed Soviet-era materials. The impression that I had from those materials and that Alexander had from the ones he looked at was that there was not that kind of clandestine relationship between the KGB and Fidel Castro in the mid-50s. But as those of you who've worked in declassified records understand, there are various levels of record. There are very secret materials that contain the most important details. There are less secret materials. If you look at the less secret materials, you might miss part of the story that's in the top secret materials. Some things are never written down. In other cases, you have partial records. So I think it's an open question. And as I mentioned in my talk, I'm not satisfied with the explanation of the relationship between Nikolai Leonov and Raul Castro, a relationship or friendship that begins in 1953 and that continues to this day. And perhaps Brian can shed some light on it. I will just give you this little story. When I was part of the American delegation to the 40th anniversary conference of the Cuban Missile Crisis in Havana in 2002, Raul wouldn't meet with us. Fidel not only wanted to meet with us, but wanted to talk to us incessantly. But Raul didn't want to meet with us. He was conveniently out of town during the conference. His wife, on the other hand, Vilma Espin, did meet with us. When the conference ended, Raul reappeared, and he had lunch with the Soviet or Russian delegation. It was a Russian delegation, although they were all very old-fashioned Soviets and very unhappy that the system had collapsed. And I thought it was interesting that Raul managed to reappear in time to meet his old Soviet colleagues, but didn't really want to shake hands with the American delegation at all.
Interesting. Well, I think that to be continued about, maybe somebody will get the records about what they might know what happened in Mexico. I don't know how long they were there, but thanks. Jean Petit, the wonderful personal story about the Cuban Missile Crisis, brought it alive, and as I told my friends, if I'm ever driving my submarine and somebody tells me to surface, it will be 90 degrees east. Remember that. I did pick that up. I also wanted to comment, Gene, that, Chris Andrew and I talked about as you remember, here the argument about human intelligence, HUMINT, and the other technological intelligence, MINT, SIGINT, etc. And interesting enough, Chris used the example that Gene did about how the two are necessary in tandem, because when you got those shots from the U-2 and the jet flights of the missile sites, you needed Penkovsky, the human intelligence agent, to identify what you had pictures of. Is that which shows you how the two need to be, in tandem at all times. Just wanted to comment on that. You mentioned the false target, or did you call it a false target? The false, was it false target or false missile, or false weapon, the electronic thing?
Yes.
You mentioned, and this is a little off the subject, but do you think at the Gulf of Tonkin, which I think you think, that the commander of the ship that set off the Vietnam War was actually being attacked by a false signal rather than an actual attack by weapons?
As a matter of fact, we had been spoofing Soviet radars in order to determine their actual capabilities, the targets that they could attack, the speeds, and so on. And it turned out there were always questions about whether or not the Soviets had been doing the same thing to us to test our early warning radars and so on. But we never really found a credible argument that they would do the same thing to us. We always felt, and I think the Soviets agreed, we had the technological edge always. However, it turned out that one morning, the director of CIA, John McCone, who knew about my team's operations with these electronic devices, he was in the White House with a meeting with President Johnson, and the news had just come in that 2 American destroyers in the Vietnam area, the Gulf of Tonkin, one of these destroyers was called the Turner Joy, and there was a second one, had claimed that they had been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. And the word flashed back to Washington, and this was the first time that Americans had been attacked in international waters. And President Johnson wanted to retaliate by starting the bombing of Hanoi. Well, it turned out that during that meeting, when they were discussing whether to start bombing North Vietnam, Director of the CIA, John McCone, said, well, why don't you let me check first and let's see if there really was an attack by torpedo boats on the destroyers, and it won't take us long. And the meeting ended, and John McCone came back to the CIA, and I was dragged onto the carpet very quickly, and he asked, can you find out if those torpedo boats were real or imaginary? And I produced a list of about 21 questions that if I could get the answers, then we would have no problem at all in answering that question very promptly. I wanted to know the state of the sea. It turned out these attacks occurred at night in total darkness. No one saw any torpedo boats. They only saw them on radar and heard them on sonar. And I couldn't get all the answers very quickly, but I was suspicious because the weather appeared to be very bad that night. The seas were rough, and I knew that sonar does not work very well in shallow water, and there's a lot of churning of the water from the storm. I also knew that if there's lightning all around, it could ruin the radar picture. But nonetheless, I was slow getting answers back. And the next morning, before I got my answers, there was, I read the newspapers that morning. The Americans had started the bombing of North Vietnam and Hanoi in particular. And the reason was in retaliation for torpedo boat attacks against American destroyers. However, I was shocked because I thought in another few hours we could have had the right answer, proof positive. It didn't happen that way. About a week later, I got all my information in. It turned out the seas were extremely rough, and I knew then sonar had no chance of having heard torpedo boats at a great distance. Also, there was lightning everywhere, and then I finally got traffic from the actual ship, from the radar operator, and I looked at what he had seen on the radar, and there's no way that there's any boat appeared to be even approaching or moving toward the American destroyers. So I knew right quick that there never had been any torpedo boats near the American ships, and they certainly had not attacked them. I assumed that it had been a nervous, edgy crew, which is normal under those conditions, but I knew absolutely that there were no attacks on the American ships. I thought I was very smart about that. I was very young at the time, but I was quick to get the word up to the director of CIA, and he said, "Gene, you don't understand. It didn't matter what you have to say." He wanted an excuse to attack, and he did so, and so I thanked him and went away. But even for a long time later, the American ambassador met with the Chinese ambassador in, I believe it was Poland, in a debate several months later. And again, the American ambassador was shouting the same story to the Chinese and the North Vietnamese in this conference, claiming that there had been machine guns now added to the torpedo boat attack and that the destroyer was shot up. So it's hard to imagine how these stories got so far along, but the North Vietnamese and the Chinese representatives stood up and angrily shouted, "There were no torpedo boats attacking your ships, and we know it and everybody else know it. Apparently you are the only one that don't know it." But anyway...
well, that's a great segue, you know, from the technology, the intelligence in Cuba and Vietnam. I mean, let's remember that was quite an active period, as the Chinese said, interesting times. Humberto, impassioned talk yesterday, wonderful, elicited a great response by Andres. Elian, I want to go on about Elian. I mean, I was fascinated that one of the active groups in the movement of Elian, beside the lawyer, Craig, whatever his name was.
Gregory Craig.
Right, was the National or World Council of Churches.
Oh, World Council.
And we find out in Chris Andrews' Metrocan archive from KGB files that the World Council of Churches was totally infiltrated by the KGB and controlled by the KGB. So when you're sitting in your Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal churches and writing checks to the National Council of Churches, money was going directly to the World Council of Churches controlled by the KGB. I thought it was interesting that they were right there in the middle of the Elian Gonzalez exchange. Can you tell us any more about that?
And I'm glad you said that rather than me, because if I would have said it, that's one of those crazy Cubans, you know, they're always saying those kind of crackpot things. They've been saying them since 1957.
Well, it's on the record. It's on the record. It's in Metrocan archive by the world's leading intelligence scholars, so I don't have to be apologetic about that.
It's right there.
Well, go ahead and tell us.
Whenever we say it, we're crackpots, but it gets even better. If I would have had more time yesterday, during that interview with Dan Rather that was taking place with Elian's father, Juan Miguel, it got to the point where Gregory Craig, he doesn't work for CBS. At one point he said, "Cut," like a director, because Juan Miguel's answers were not coming across on camera with sufficient emotion. If you can imagine such a thing for a Cuban, but he didn't like it. For his case wasn't being made. Gregory Craig stopped the proceedings right there. They ran to a drama school in New York and got a dramatic actor, brought him back into the studio, and had him mouthing the answers from Juan Miguel. This is what we were watching on 60 Minutes. This is what swayed, in my opinion, 70% of the American public. Oh, that poor dad wants his little boy back. How come those mean Cubans in Miami won't let that dad have his little boy? You see, and that's what was going on. Typical Castroite stage managing.
But it wasn't ever clear, you know, that, in the Clinton administration's handling of this. I mean, that's like us sending somebody back to East Berlin. it's like sending somebody back across the bridge. But you know all that, and I know how you feel about it. But and we thank you. Now, Brian Littell, we invite to the panel, though you haven't heard him yet, but you have met him. And that's what I love about the conference. Our speakers are here. You've met them and talked to them, and I hope bought their books. But we include Brian in the panel before his keynote at 11. Brian, I would like to pose to you, can you sort of tell us what we've been doing here for the last day and a half?
Bernie, I think it's been terrific. I think you've organized a wonderful conference. Well,
I wasn't looking for that. Thank you.
I think you've really put together a tremendous group of experts. Could I comment on a few of the things that have already been said
that's what I meant.
by other panelists?
Do, yeah.
Art is right. I think Art described Fidel's leadership abilities, extraordinary leadership abilities, very well. One little note about the oral accomplishment, the speeches. This man has spoken more on the public record than any political figure in human history. Thousands and thousands of speeches. I suspect he gave his last two on July 26th, on the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. But this man has spoken. He holds the world's record, and I don't think it will ever be matched. 48 years. Another thing about Fidel Castro's leadership skills that ought to be mentioned, and I devote a good deal of attention to it in my book, is his the imperative, the indulgence of violence, intimidation, threat, and actual violence, including lethal violence. There are stories in my book of assassination attempts when he was a university student, at least 4 assassination attempts, and 1 or 2 of them were actually carried out, actually successful, though it was never proven that he was the gunman. But there's one story I tell in the book that's really beyond doubt about how, as a university student, he had a rifle and he shot a student rival in the back from a distance, and he began to employ violence successfully, and the threat of violence and intimidation, as a child. One of the most remarkable stories about Fidel that I recount in the book, with a little bit of elaboration from some very good sources, when he was about 7 or 8, it's not clear exactly how old he was expelled from a Catholic school, and with his 2 brothers, Ramon and Raul, and they were sent back to the family estate, the big farm where their Spanish immigrant father was very successful. The parents did not want to send the boys back to that school. The priests there had said that they were so violent and they were so uncouth, and they were just such country boys without any city manners or sensibilities. They didn't want them to go back. The older brother Ramon was content not to go back, and so was Raul, because he wanted to go to a military school, which he did. Fidel, though, with a sense of upward mobility, even as a young child, he demanded that he be sent back to this school. And the parents said, "No, you can't go back. You've been too violent. You've abused all of the rules." And he said to his mother finally, after a lot of recrimination back and forth, he finally said to his mother, Lina Rus, "If you don't send me back to that school, I will burn this house down." And he was sent back. He got his way. So as a child of 7 or 8, he learned that the threat of violence, and it was a realistic threat, the parents believed that he actually would burn the house down. They sent him back to that school, and for the rest of his life, Fidel Castro has employed such tactics in forcing his will on others. The circumstance of the house has another interesting aspect to it. Art referred to it in his speech the other night. Fidel was not allowed in that house. It was the big house. It was the house where the Spanish immigrant father and his legitimate wife and her 2 children, it's where they lived. And Fidel, as a child, was not allowed in that house. He had to live in a peasant shack with his mother, and she was the maid, and her parents. They lived in this little hovel, and he hated that big house. So his threat to burn it down reflected not just his commitment to violence and intimidation, but his emotional anger, the ferocity of his feelings toward his father and the legitimate wife and that house that was off limits to him. All his life, Fidel Castro has continued to be motivated by those kinds of forces. So violence, the impulse to violence, is one of the other key characteristics of his leadership.
And the whole dynamics of the situation now with Raul, then the same. Yes, Art.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. In spite of those incredibly long, numerous speeches, there's not, well, maybe there's not any phrase that is memorable from any of it. Even his "history will absolve me" is really from Hitler. And the other thing I was going to say, arithmetic would suggest that he had to be a little older than 7, because that would make Raul 2 years old in school. And that,
sorry, is he what?
Arithmetic would suggest he would have to have been a little older during that burning the house story, because Raul would have been 2 years old, and I don't think he was in school then.
There's so much confusion about Fidel's age. He's really not 80 years old. He really didn't just celebrate his 80th birthday. It was his 79th. When he was being admitted to school as one of the schools, I don't know if it was elementary or high school, the father got a false birth certificate that made him a year older, bribed a local official in order so that Fidel could be admitted to this school. He had to be older than he actually was. I know this because I found interviews that his mother and 3 of his sisters granted in the late 1950s, in 58 and 59. The mother and 3 sisters all said that he was born in 1927, not 1926. I figure his mother and 3 of his sisters know. And Barbara Walters once pressed Fidel on this in an interview. It was in the 1970s. She had heard that maybe that there was some confusion about his age, and she pressed him on it. And he gave her a very equivocal answer. He said, "Well, Barbara, I accept the older age, the less advantageous age." It seemed to me that he was implicitly acknowledging that he's really a year younger. But he has lived the lie all of these years. He has lived the lie that he's a year older than he actually is.
But with no information, no media, no free speech, no political parties, no debate in public about anything political, we will never know until, again, intelligence down the road will tell us what really happened in Cuba. Then now to the audience, we have a special guest. We've had several. I think Nigel's still sleeping, so we'll get him later. But Nigel made it. But I want to recognize Nigel. But John Sullivan is here. John, would you stand up? Would you bring a microphone to John? John has been in contact with us. He was a polygraph for the CIA for 30-some years, and he has comments and a point of view, and I wanted to be sure he had an opportunity to speak to the group.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bernie. My field, if you will, was human intelligence, and I first began working with the Cubans in 1964 when I was in the Army, when I debriefed refugees down in Miami. Then when I joined the agency in 1968, in 69 I went back and I debriefed refugees. But over the years I worked with a lot of Cuban agents. My main enemy in many ways was the DGI. And I'll say right up front, they're the second best intelligence service we ever worked against. The only one better was the East Germans. And considering the economic hardships that the DGI had to contend with, I had the utmost respect for them as opponents. Also, and it relates to Cubans in general, but when I first came to the agency, the first thing I was told was, polygraph doesn't work on Cubans, period. They were raised in an environment where they lie all the time, which is that's a lie, period. The Cubans, Americans I worked with in Miami were some of the most honorable, hardworking, dedicated people I've ever worked with in my life, and they were truly honorable men. And that is a lie, but the fact of the matter is the belief was the Cubans beat the polygraph hands down. When all of the Cubans, agents were exposed as double agents, we were told, well, they all beat the polygraph. Well, coincidentally, yesterday when I was talking to Brian, he said, John, tell me the scoop. How come the Cubans always beat the polygraph? No one has ever said, no one has ever asked, well, if they beat it, no one ever asked, how many did you catch? Well, we caught an awful lot more than ever beat us. In 1978, Cuban ops and the CIA came down to polygraph. They were outraged because none of their agents was passing the polygraph test. And they were telling us they can't all be bad. Yes, they can. But that's what we were told. And we were vilified. We were told we didn't know what they were told. We didn't know what we were talking about. We were a bunch of head-hunting polygraph examiners. We really didn't have a clue about the Cubans. 2 years later, we were invited down to the farm for a conference on how do we deal with the fact the Cubans aren't passing our polygraph test. And once again, we were vilified. I mean, we were ambushed and we were harshly criticized. Now, I don't know how much effect that had on how we did business. But the fact of the matter is that suddenly they began passing their tests. And I won't comment anything further on that. Now, I don't want to go too far astray, but one of the primary targets of my work were Cuban defectors. I did ship jumpers, diplomats who defected, and I remember in particular, and this is in my book that'll be out in February, we had a diplomat walk into one of our embassies, and he said he was a Cuban diplomat and he wanted to come to the United States. And as a show of good faith, he gave us $25,000 just to show. He'd stolen it from the embassy where he was working, just to show what a good guy he was. Well, there were several back in Washington that thought this guy has to be a DGI plant. And there were some that thought, no, he's the real deal. Even the DGI is not going to give someone $25,000, and that's not going to happen. Well, he filled out a personal history statement, and I looked it over, and I really didn't know. So I went to one of the Cuban interpreters, and I said, Julio, tell me what's wrong with this guy. And he said, give me till tomorrow, John, and I'll let you know. So the next day I saw Julio, and he said, he's got to be lying about one or two things. He claims he went to the Havana School of Business. He also claims he was born on a certain date. He could not have gone to the Havana School of Business because he would have been 14 when he entered. He said the Havana School of Business was one of the best schools in Havana. The civil service in Havana got a lot of its people out of there. This kid absolutely could not have done that. Or he's lying about his age. I said, okay, that's a start. Then I looked up his itinerary. How did he get from the embassy where he was to where he turned himself in? And I noticed that he had stopped in Switzerland. Well, there was a direct flight. Why would he stop in Switzerland? What's in Switzerland? What?
Banks.
Banks. So one of the questions I was going to ask, there were two questions already. Were you born on such and such a date? Were you a graduate of the Havana School of Business? Number 3 was, did you turn in all of the money that you took when you left? Number 4, have you ever worked with or have you ever been a member of the DGI? He also claimed that one of his diplomatic jobs had been to meet with the Communist Party in Europe, Chief. That was question. Those are the 5 questions.
Let's get to the conclusion, John, okay? Tell us the conclusion of the polygraph, please.
The conclusion was, I said he's lying about the money. Absolutely. It was as if I hit him with a cattle prod when I asked him that question. So I confronted him. I said, you clearly didn't turn in all the money. And I went on for about an hour. Finally he said to me, well, you can't make me give it back. And I said, oh, yes, we can. I said, you're no longer a political refugee. You're a common thief. And if the Cuban government asks us to extradite you, we're going to do it. No, you won't. We had him out at the airport at Dulles, putting on a plane to Canada when he finally admitted he lied about everything. But again, if there's something to lose, anybody can be caught in a polygraph test. I'll leave it at that.
And thank you, John. I think what John was trying to say, there's a myth in the agency, right? Looking at Brian and Gene, that you said, John, Cubans can always beat the polygraph or whatever. It turns out that's not true. I think John's here to get the record set straight, and I think he accomplished that. Any comment up here from anybody? We can move on to the more germane things to the conference. Okay, let's open it up now to your questions. I see Paul Delacourt right over here. Can you go right to this gentleman here? Right here. Yeah, that's it. I saw 2 people get up. I'm sorry.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the panel for sharing so much light with their history and detailed statistics that we have not heard before. And I personally, having visited Cuba under Batista and in 2001 under Castro, you have certainly dispelled many of the false impressions tourists like I would have gotten by just being casually there. I think it's fitting that we're talking about dictators after you're meeting our local Raleigh representative, Bernie Reeves, who's our local dictator, and if you've seen how he's running this conference. I have 3 questions, and they hopefully can be answered quickly. First, Venezuela. I wonder what role you see Venezuela and its dictator playing in the leadership gap and the money gap that's going to be exposed after Castro. Secondly, the money you spoke about to rebuild Cuba. You mentioned many millions, perhaps billions of dollars. I see many U.S. businesses prepared to invest money to do that, to help with that, to create jobs, to create businesses, to create leadership and enterprise. And I wonder when you see, if you ever see, Cuba opening up to accept that type of business enterprise. And third, the Miami Group. Anytime you mention Cuba, you hear, and all you see is the agitation coming out of South Florida and South Miami. I wonder what role they are going to really play, and are they really as important as they think they are? Thank you.
The first question was Venezuela, and would Brian maybe be the first one to take that from being down there, and then from your previous job?
Well, Hugo Chavez is, of course, and conspicuously an enthusiastic, adoring disciple of Fidel Castro. They are very, very close. Chavez was at Fidel's bedside just last week. You probably saw the video or the photographs in the news. Chavez traveled from Caracas, was in the room with hospital room with Fidel, both wearing these red shirts. Chavez, through his career, I think, entire career, has been inspired and motivated, perhaps supported by Cuban intelligence. When Chavez mounted his unsuccessful coup in 1992 against the government, the democratically elected government of Carlos Andrés Pérez, it's possible that he already was in touch with Cuban intelligence. I don't know of any hard evidence of that, so it's speculative to say that. But looking back now on their relationship, I think it's a reasonable thing to speculate about. I can tell you this, that when Chavez was overthrown himself 10 years later, he was, of course, elected legitimately. He's been elected more than once legitimately with substantial majorities of the Venezuelans supporting him democratically. There's a lot of irony in that, but it's true. In April of 2002, there was a military coup, a brief one that lasted only about a day and a half, against Chavez. Fidel Castro has recently admitted on the record, there's a French-Spanish biographer of Fidel's who tells this story from Fidel himself, that when Fidel learned that Chavez had been overthrown, he got on the phone and he stayed up all night, and he was all night long calling, berating Venezuelan generals and other Venezuelans, berating them, encouraging them, motivating them, convincing them to get together and restore Chavez to power. And they did. And Fidel Castro takes credit for it. Chavez supports Fidel Castro and Cuba to the tune today of about $2.5 billion. It's about 100,000 barrels of oil a day, plus diesel and aircraft fuel, all of the high technology fuels, aviation fuels, come from Venezuela. There's also Venezuelan investment in a big refinery on the south coast and some other Venezuelan support. By the end of the year, if oil prices stay more or less where they are, the total Venezuelan subsidy will be close to $2.5 billion, which is only half of what the Soviets provided in economic assistance. But without that $2.5 billion, the Cuban economy would be completely on the ropes. So this is a relationship made in heaven for the Cubans. Although it's hard to say how it's going to evolve, because I don't see any evidence that Raul Castro has a comparable relationship with Chavez that Fidel has. So it's conceivable that it will change now that Fidel is no longer calling the shots. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's a very interesting situation.
Everybody wants to know that, and I know they're exchanging citizens and citizenships and so forth, so no telling what's the cooking there. The second question, I think, Paul, had to do with the economic currency business. Am I correct? Who feels comfortable answering that?
Art.
Art feels comfortable answering that.
I'd feel more comfortable if I could have some of that coffee he's been drinking. I don't know what he puts in there. The question about American investment, I think the first group, and probably the most likely group to go into Cuba, will be the resort industry, the tourism industry. They can exist in fairly turbulent sort of political situations because they put a rope on one end of the beach and another rope on an armed guard, and then they fly the tourist right in, within a mile or so. Kind of garrison tourism. After that, I'm not sure. I think there's going to be a lot of turbulence for a while, and some people make money, to be sure, but I think the three biggest problems the United States will have to deal with are prevention, and this was in the Wall Street Journal the other day, a long article about it, how to prevent a massive outmigration of people leaving Cuba in the next weeks, months after Castro or whoever collapses. The second one is a question of drugs. Cuba has a huge coastline with it's an archipelago with a lot of islands, and it's a wonderful place to stop on your way to Miami or New Orleans. And so that'll be one of the big challenges. Who do you deal with? The Dominican Republic, which is also a huge transshipment point. Transshipment means a stop point before it goes on. For example, ecstasy from Holland comes through there. And so that'll be another challenge. Who do you deal with? Who are the authorities that are going to help you supervise? And then the third one, I think, Cuba has almost a developed world population growth. It's like Germany, it's not growing at all. Underdeveloped countries, what you expect to see is a very rapid population growth, but Cuba is not. So they have a relatively old population. And so one of the challenges is going to be, how do you support that? What kind of social systems do you put in place? What kind of retirement, health, and so on? And we hear a lot about Cuba's health, but in fact, I believe that, and a number of my doctor friends from Duke and other places who've been there confirm it, there are a lot of problems. And so I think those are the three biggest challenges. I forgot what your third, the Cuban-American group in Miami. There's a lot of money there, and there's no question about that. And a lot of them want to go and have a little winter home or something, I don't know. There are a lot of lessons from Germany and from other former communist countries. It ain't easy to go back and get your property, and most of them probably are not interested in that. 3 surveys from the University of Miami have asked how many of you guys are going back, and it ranges between 6 and 12%. So one of the things that Castro, and particularly Alarcon, the president of the parliament, whatever, one of his first things is, these Americans are going to come, these Cuban Americans are going to come take your homes, kick you out, take your free lunch, free whatever they get. Most of them are not going to do that. Are you going back?
But no. As a matter of fact, I was about to say, I would be willing to bet, my hunch is that even that 12% is high. I'm willing to bet that once those go there, see what it looks like, they're coming back. I base that on what happened to New Orleans with Katrina. Right after Katrina, we can't wait, let's go back home and rebuild. Well, guess what? They came back to New Orleans, looked around, yikes, left again. Right now, New Orleans has half the population of pre-Katrina, and Hurricane Castro destroyed Cuba worse than Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans. So I think you're going to see the same thing.
I want to add 2 things. As I understand it, and I forgot where I saw this, but under the Helms-Burton Act, which has to do with Cuban repatriation, that private property will be kept, in other words, available for redistribution back to its owners. Is this not in the Helms-Burton Act? Do you all know this? In other words, I mean that if you go back and claim your Caterpillar dealership, which of course a man from Raleigh owned down there, or property, aren't there going to be hearings like are going on in Nicaragua? Is that not true?
These property issues, Bernie, are very complicated. Helms-Burton is really devoted more to strengthening the economic embargo, providing penalties against foreign owners of property in Cuba that was expropriated by Castro.
Right.
People like that, Spaniards, Canadians, Mexicans, it's only been enforced a few times. If they have been trafficking in properties that were seized in Cuba from American citizens, including Cuban Americans who were not citizens when the property was seized, those foreigners are denied visas to come to the United States. That really hurts because a lot of them really do business in the U.S. They like to come with their families. But another one of the harshest provisions, the third country provision in Helms-Burton, Title IV, has been waived every time. Every 6 months it has been waived by presidents, whether Clinton or Bush. It's been waived every 6 months. The property issues are very, very complicated.
Well, and we don't need to go any further. Maybe we'll have a whole other conference on that. I have to add one more thing. As you all know, one of the best-known former behind the Iron Curtain security agents was Ion Pachipa. Pachipa was in charge of the Romanian equivalent of the KGB and was hand in glove with the KGB in many ops around the world, as we all know, and wrote a famous book called Red Horizons, which was used as in the trial to convict the Ceausescus, as you may remember, who were stealing Romania blind. Pachipa popped up 2 weeks ago about the Castro situation and remembered Raul, knew Raul, had spent time hunting with Raul and had played with Raul, but he made it really clear that Raul was a major international drug dealer. And Art mentioned drugs, and that popped in my head. Have you had any other corroboration of that from anywhere else besides Pachipa, any of you? No?
No. No, but there is one more impact, and that is as Cuba becomes more popular to the American investment and to just one of the CEOs of one of the Spanish chains told me there will be an avalanche of interest afterwards. What impact is that going to have, and what destabilization consequences will those avalanches have on the other Caribbean islands that increasingly rely on tourism and American visits and so on for their economy? I think that's something that not a whole lot of people have thought about, but the Dominican Republic is now the largest attractor of, and they probably will be okay because they've kind of developed an upscale sort of tourism industry, but some of those other ones could be devastated, and that will have a lot of implications for the United States as well.
Let's go to the audience again. Right here. Hi, Andres, go ahead. Is there a microphone?
I just want to add a comment about the drug situation, and surprised that it was mentioned the case of General Ochoa and the La Guardia brothers, who were military and the secret police, who were put on trial in the mid-'80s by the Fidel and Raul, that were actually executed, and because they were accused of trafficking drugs. They were collaborating with the traffic drug to the United States, and nobody actually believed that they were the only ones, and that they were acting independently from Raul, who was, of course, the Minister of Defense, and who was very close to General Ochoa. They were buddies for many, many years. So it's a very, very valid point that nobody believes that that was it. But they used General Ochoa and the La Guardia brothers as the scapegoats.
Well, according to Pachipa, there was a politicization of the drug trade as part of destabilizing the West. You've heard that in sort of a conspiratorial way, but Pachipa, who is a reliable security source, does say that Raul and the Soviets were all involved in trying to traffic drugs, making money themselves, but also to undermine the West. That's another story.
Well, no, one statement, Bernie, you're exactly right. In 1993, a federal prosecutor in Miami, it's quoted in my book, said, the case we have right now against Raul Castro is stronger than the one we had against Manuel Noriega.
There you go. Okay. So that's just something to keep in mind, sort of corruption. Yes, ma'am.
There have been two I think, successful PR events within the past 10 years. One was the award-winning movie, the Buena Vista Social Club, and the musicians have had CDs, worldwide concert tours. In fact, 2 of them were here in Raleigh. You have not mentioned religion to any great extent. Fidel did have a Jesuit education of sorts, but he was most solicitous of Pope Jean Paul when he was in Cuba. And these 2 events seem to be kind of antithetical to the way things are run in Cuba. Could you comment on those 2 events or similar ones?
Let's let Tim do one.
Well, I'm not sure. Is the point of the question that the Buena Vista Social Club was a PR crusade by the Cuban government? I don't know. I have no idea. The music was wonderful, though. So. The other question, the other element of the question is interesting because it reminds me of the story I told yesterday about Fidel's tentative approach to gaining Soviet military assistance and how his, at least in 1959, his great concern about the power of the Catholic Church and his unwillingness to push forward the Second Revolution until he felt that he was more powerful than the Catholic Church, or at least could take that energy and use it for his own purposes. And I guess what I'd like to know from my fellow panelists who know a lot more about contemporary events in Cuba than I do, or the audience for that matter, is what role the Catholic Church is playing today, and to what extent is there a leadership, a Christian democratic leadership, if you will, that might emerge from the Catholic Church when Fidel's time passes?
Hey, Don Boning, when you were in Miami, do you pick up any Catholic Church, or of course Umberto will have something to say, but you have not picked up any signals on that
kind of thing anymore now that I'm no longer.
Paul would ask. Umberto, you wanted to say something?
I'll just say very briefly, Cardinal Jaime Ortega in Cuba is not Cardinal Minzensi.
Right.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I like Castro's quote or statement to the Pope. He said, "Don't expect any miracles."
Right, exactly. Any more? Lloyd, and then we'll get you next.
Let me preface my question. Humberto, I read part of your book last night to my wife, the chapter on...
Hold the microphone up, please.
2506 Brigade.
Right.
Because I was a major in the field artillery at Fort Sill in 61, 62. And I was operations officer for battalion, and we were school troop firing daily. And during the 63, the spring sometime, we were, the Army assigned 10 of the 2506 brigade members to my battalion, and I used them as safety officers at the howitzers, at the guns, firing daily. One of them was the deputy commander.
Oliva?
Oliva, yes. And my wife was 7 months pregnant, but she was kind of a shepherd for the wives of the 2506, and was answering, I think, to Mrs. Ochiva. They would get together, and Ms. Ochiva would say how much they needed, and my wife would arrange to get it for her. And let's see, our last child was born there, and the Cuban wives gave her a baby shower and a christening dress. Okay. My question is, well, right after that, I was transferred to Thailand for a year, unaccompanied. a terrible time to leave the wife with 3 children. My question is, what happened to the to Ochiva and the 2506 Brigade members?
Okay, well, Oliva himself, Don's better. What is he, brigadier or major general?
He's whichever is higher, because I made an error. I just talked to him the other day, in fact.
He made either brigadier or major
No,
general?
he's a major general.
A major general.
I had him as a brigadier in
Very
the first edition, in one place in the first edition of my book, which I realized I made a mistake, and I wrote him and told him I was correcting it, and we've been exchanging emails the last few days, in fact.
Good.
There's an interesting story about Oliva. He was at what is in Panama when the revolution, can I recite it?
Yeah, speak up is what I was going to say, yeah.
He was in Panama teaching at what was the School of the Americas, and it was something, it was not even called the School of the Americas, at the time of Castro takeover in Cuba, and he was an instructor there. He was in the Cuban military before, and he was assigned to the Panama, or transferred, not assigned, but given temporary duty in Panama to teach at the School of the Americas, a U.S. military school there. And he said he was at a party on New Year's Eve of January 1958. And at 4 a.m., he and his wife went home, and they called, somebody called him, I don't know, whenever time it was, and said, Batista just left. Said he woke up, answered the phone, then he said he went back to sleep, and it didn't occur to him what had been said until...
Yeah.
But then, what happened, he had no idea. He didn't know whether he should take asylum in Panama, whether he should stay where he was, and they told him just to remain where he was. And when about 6 weeks later, the Cubans apparently discovered there was a the Castro Cubans discovered there was a Cuban military officer in Panama teaching at the School of the Americas. They ordered him home, and that's when he was really out. Anyway, he went back to Cuba in mid-February of 1959, and he went through San Jose, and the people at the airport, the other passengers at the airport in San Jose, Costa Rica, were chanting Batistiano, and very... He went back to, then he finally got back to Havana, and the first place they took him was La Cabana. And the first person he met was Che Guevara. But they reassigned him to, he'd been in the armored division at Fort Sill, well, later, but they assigned him to a place called Miramar, south of Havana, which was a tank battalion. And then they reassigned him to Pepe Fernandez, who was the head of the militia in Cuba. And that thing got worse and worse, and so he finally decided to get out. And he went to a motel, and the Americans finally got him out in August of 1960. And he spent a week in Miami, and then he went to Guatemala, where he became the deputy commander of the 2506 Brigade. But in Fort Sill, he told me also that Bobby Kennedy had asked him in the fall of 1963, before Kennedy was assassinated, to draft an invasion plan for Cuba, and how utilizing what Jack Kennedy had named him the official representative of all Cubans in the U.S. military. And Bobby had asked him to, he was very close to Bobby, and Bobby had asked him to draft an invasion plan for Cuba. And then Kennedy got assassinated, and he couldn't get any answers out of Washington. And he went to Washington in December or January of 1964. And Bobby Kennedy called him at the hotel, or Bobby Kennedy's secretary called him at the hotel and said he was at the White House. It was January of '64. He was at the White House, and he was going to send his car over, and he wanted to Oliva to come over and talk to President Johnson. President Johnson wanted to talk to him. And Johnson and Kennedy did not get along, Bobby Kennedy. And so Bobby met him at the gate and took him up to see LBJ, and that's when LBJ told him that his program was finished with the soldiers in the U.S. Army. But as I was talking to Humberto about this the other day, Oliva and Chiche Quintero, two of the more notable Cubans involved in some of the anti-Castro activities, both still contend that had Kennedy lived, Castro would be gone. They still have great regard for Bobby Kennedy.
How about that? We can take one more question before we take a break. And don't forget, we can ask questions. We'll have a half-hour time. You were next. I'm sorry, Jimmy. We'll do two more questions. Go ahead, right here. Raise your hand. Yes. Short, please.
Yeah. A few years ago, Castro delivered a speech at Tehran University in Iran, and he said the people and governments of Cuba and Iran could put the imperialists down to their knees. Let's assume that the Iranian leadership is able to produce a few dirty bombs. In that scenario, we could have the situation of the Iranian leadership asking probably Raúl Castro to allow the dirty bombs to be placed in Cuba, and I'm not talking large sites, I am talking of a small launcher that the one we have seen in southern Lebanon. Is that a real threat or possibility?
Dirty bombs being made. Do y'all know anything about that? Brian, Gene Petit. You're a dirty bomb guy, no?
Well, you're absolutely right. Fidel said that. It was in May of 2001 in Tehran, which of course was just a few months before 9/11 in the United States. He was in the presence of Iranian ayatollahs, radical Muslim ayatollahs, and he said on the record, was recorded saying it, "Together we will bring imperialism to its knees." It was a frightening statement by Castro, and I think it does reflect the genuine feelings, his lifelong feelings, that he's waging a permanent war against the United States.
I ran into that too, and actually put it in one of my columns. Remember, Castro made a public comment when we assassinated Moussaoui. Remember, 2 months ago, Castro made a public statement that we were a murderous and brutal regime, America was, for killing this terrorist, and that he would welcome more communication with Islamic terrorism. He made a public statement. So that, interestingly enough, Cuba becoming a staging ground for terrorist entry into the United States is a possibility that I'm sure the intelligence agencies will be examining. Jim Branch, last question. Don't forget we have a nice half-hour break before the keynote by Brian Littell. You can get books signed and ask more questions of the speakers. Jim.
Since this is a spy conference, I thought I would go back into a dark curtain here, and maybe Gene and Umberto can tell us something. Is there any connection that anybody on the panel has between the Bay of Pigs, the CIA, the Mafia, and the Kennedy assassination? It's a question that people always smile. Look at them, everybody's smiling, and nobody wants to talk about it. But since we're with Bernie, I thought maybe you guys would give me your best
opinion. And I have
opinion.
told them a bit about the Raleigh call, by the way.
The Raleigh call, and it's just an interesting thing, and maybe you'll say, go through yes, no, yes, no.
Gene handed me a note about it, so let's let Gene Petit go first on that. The connection with the Kennedy assassination with all these activities with Castro.
It turns out that the vast majority of Americans today believe that the CIA was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. They base that on the fact that there was a survey made that confirmed that 73% of the people believed that the CIA was involved. It turns out that that's because of the movie by Oliver Stone entitled JFK. And that has more influence on Americans' opinions, apparently, than anything else. But that movie by Oliver Stone was based on a book written by a man named Jim Garrison in New Orleans. However, Jim Garrison's book was based on newspaper accounts around the United States that the CIA was involved. But let me tell you where those newspaper articles came from. It came from a KGB plot of disinformation. The KGB planted a false story in an Italian communist magazine called Il Serail. It was a daily, I believe, a communist publication. it was a false story claiming the CIA was involved in the assassination, and American newspapers eventually picked it up and played that story along. And that's the origins. It was purely a very effective KGB disinformation campaign.
Which was a favorite ploy of the KGB, but they called active measures.
Now, by the way, how it got in, Oliver Stone learned about it was that Castro arranged a film festival in Havana. And he invited movie producers and so on. And Oliver Stone went to that film festival in Havana. And during that, he was handed a book by Jim Garrison, which was repeating the KGB disinformation. So that's how it happened.
For the record, Jim Garrison was my father-in-law's best friend. He was de facto godfather of my wife. The man was a complete nutcase. Complete. I am telling you.
Now, the Kennedy assassination, we managed to go 2.5 days. We shan't go any further except in private conversations. However, I have been letting them know about the incident that happened with us in Raleigh and leave out Oliver Stone and Jim Garrison looking at other issues. But it is an intriguing period. The Castro so-called revolution or takeover at Cuba was the beginning of, I guess, what you would call the modern era, especially for the boomers, the campus intellectuals, the Vietnam War, the whole global positioning of the United States, the nuclear confrontations. I mean, it's been a hell of a ride, and I think so is this conference, and I think we owe again our speakers, and then later we'll clap for Brian Littell. A big round of applause. Thank you. We will take a social break, buy books, get autographs, ask questions, and be here for the keynote address. We'll find out what is next in Cuba.
Viva Cuba.
Hey,
good man. Good man.